I was not supposed to be there. That is the first thing you needed to understand. I was a scout by trade and a salvager by necessity, which is a distinction the frontier makes less of than you might expect. In the canyon lanes east of Rakuyu, where Toutaku's patrols ran on a schedule tight enough to navigate by, and the roads through the red rock switched back in ways that confused men who had not grown up reading them, the difference between a scout and a scavenger was largely a matter of who you were scouting for. I had been working both sides of that line for long enough that the line had stopped meaning much to me. I pulled iron from the rivers after Toutaku's patrols were done with whatever they had been doing. I cataloged rotation schedules and transit times, and the gaps in patrol coverage that a careful man could use to move between settlements without being seen. I learned which villages kept their grain in underground stores and which kept it in barns. Not because I was planning anything ambitious, but because information of that kind was currency in occupied territory, and currency kept a man fed and mobile and out of the work gangs. It was survival. It was nothing more or less than that, and I had spent 2 years constructing a peace, with calling it nothing more or less. Peace was not a comfortable one. I do not want you to think I had stopped understanding what the maps in my head could be used for, or what I was choosing not to use them for. I understood. I had made a calculation, the same calculation that most practical men in occupied territory make, that the cost of engaging with the problem exceeded the budget I was willing to spend, that there were limits to what one man with good maps and a smart horse could accomplish against an empire that had been refining its occupation for years, that the men and women I had watched try and fail had been braver than me and had also been just as dead. I did not ride toward trouble. I did not carry a sword. I had a horse that was better than average at navigating in the dark, and a set of maps in my head that no one else in the canyon possessed. And those two things together were worth more to my continued existence than bravery, which was what I told myself when I thought about it, which was as infrequently as I could arrange. I had watched good men die for Mauritia. I had watched women braver than me lead things that failed so completely that the failure became a caution story told quietly in the villages that survived them. I had watched the empire put down resistance with the efficiency of a system that has had enough practice to stop thinking of it as events and start thinking of it as maintenance. Every village that was made an example became a lesson delivered to the surrounding settlements at no additional cost. Every man who rode east instead of engaging with the trouble was a demonstration that the lesson had taken. I was a very good demonstration. So when I found 3 men face down in the shallows of the canyon river on a cold morning in the early dry season, my first thought was practical. Dead bodies in the water drew patrols within the day, and patrols finding dead bodies in a canyon where I had been working all week would complicate my operational situation considerably. Live bodies I could move, orient, and redirect. I dragged them out because they were a logistics problem, not because I had suddenly reconsidered my priorities. I built a fire behind a rock shelf where the smoke would diffuse against the sandstone face, and I got water on their burns, and I sat back and waited for them to become my problem in more specific terms. First one came awake swinging. I had expected that, and I was 3 steps back before his eyes focused and found me not a soldier. He was large in the specific way of men who have been built by fighting rather than born to it. Broad across the shoulder, deliberate in his movements, with a stillness between actions that suggested he was not wasting energy on anything decorative. He looked at me the way you look at weather. Assessing, not hostile, not warm. He said a name. I told him I did not know where that person was. He said it differently, and I understood he was asking about the sword. The river kept it, I said. He did not say anything to that. He looked at the current for a long moment, and across his face moved something I recognized from years of watching men absorb bad news. Grief processing itself into something more actionable, which in some men is despair, and in others is a cold and specific kind of anger. In him it seemed to be neither. It settled into something quieter. Acceptance maybe, though not the resigned kind. The second one came awake faster and louder. He had armor in red and gray, and a voice calibrated for parade grounds, and he began cataloging the situation before he was fully upright. The fall, the trap on the bridge, the loss of the sword, the current condition of each of his limbs, the character of the man who had engineered their defeat. All of it enumerated at volume while he tested his joints against the morning. He was angry in the clean, uncomplicated way of a man whose feelings have not yet caught up with his situation. He looked at me mid-inventory and demanded to know who I was. I told him I was the person who pulled them out of the river. He considered this, nodded once, and went back to his inventory. The third one woke quietly. He lay still before he opened his eyes. And when he opened them, he was looking at the sky with the expression of a man who has already made a decision about something and is now living in the aftermath of it. Then he sat up and looked at his hand, which was empty and curled around the shape of something that was not there. And he closed the hand into a fist and looked at me. He said, not performed, not transactional. He had assessed a fact. Stranger pulled us from the water. We owe him something, and resolved to pay it with the plainest available currency, which was honesty. I told him it was nothing. It was not nothing, he said. What is your name? I told him. He gave me his in return, and introduced the other two. And the names were given simply, without titles, without the weight that I would later learn they carried among the people of this land. Out by the fire behind the rock shelf, they were just 3 wet men who needed to understand their situation before they moved. I gave them the situation. Toutaku's patrols ran this canyon on a half-day rotation. The General Koshin Gion had been operating in this region specifically. Hunting them, I gathered, or hunting something they carried, which amounted to the same problem. The villages upriver were occupied, but not garrisoned heavily. If they moved east and moved now, they could be past Koshin's operational range before the next patrol cycle. Ryubi listened to all of this with complete attention. Then he said, "What about the village at the bend?" I told him the village at the bend was in Toutaku's path regardless. It was not our problem to solve. He looked at me without judgment. He was not telling me I was wrong. He was simply operating from a different set of premises than mine. And he was not asking me to adopt them. He considered the eastern road I had described. And he considered the direction of the sound of the village. And he got up and tested his legs and found them functional. And he looked toward the river. "The sword," he said. I explained what I knew about the current at the base of the cliff. It moved at a rate that had probably already taken the sword 3 kilometers downstream, or wedged it in rock, or buried it in silt where no one would find it before the season flooded. We did not have the equipment or the time to. "I will fight without it," he said. And that was the moment I should have left. I had done what I was going to do. I had pulled 3 strangers from the water, oriented them, and pointed them toward an exit. A man with my priorities would have saddled up and ridden east at a pace, consistent with not being caught by whatever Toutaku sent, in response to whatever these 3 were going to do. The frontier was full of men who had survived the occupation by virtue of their excellent sense of when to be somewhere else. Stayed. I cannot even explain it as a decision exactly. It was more like failing to leave. I followed them toward the bend, and that is where the rest of this happened. The news came from a boy, maybe 12, running barefoot with the particular flat-out terror of someone who has seen adults die and has not yet learned to distribute that terror across his face in a way that would make it easier for other people to manage. He had a cut above his right ear and he ran straight to Ryuubi, because Ryuubi was at the front of our small column and something about the way Ryuubi stood, open, unhurried, not flinching from the sound of someone approaching at speed, invited this kind of approach. Toutaku forces had come from the north road. They were moving through the village. Nobody had been killed yet. But the people had been assembled in the square, and Koshin Gien was moving through the rows, looking for something, looking for them. Looking for the sword. Kanyu, the large one, put his hand on his weapon and said one word. It was a question that had already decided its own answer. Ryuubi crouched down to the boy's level and told him to go to the river and stay there until someone he trusted came for him. The boy went. Because there was something in the quality of that instruction, the specific weight of it, not a reassurance, not a promise that everything would be fine, just a clear directive from a man who was not lying to him. Now did the river sound like a reasonable destination? Ryuubi stood and looked at his brothers. "Koshin will not find the sword here," he said. He will hurt these people in the trying. He said several things about Koshin at a volume that could have been heard 3 ridges over. Some of them were accurate. Kanyu did not say anything. He was already moving. Ryuubi looked back at me, and this was the second moment I should have left. And the second moment I failed to. You do not have to come, he said. This is not your fight, unless you make it so. I thought about this for approximately 4 seconds. I know where Koshin's men park their horses, I said. That's going to matter if we need to move fast afterward. He nodded once, as though this was sufficient, and we went. Koshin Gyan was not large in the way that conquerors in stories are large. He was precise. Every movement had been examined for efficiency before it was deployed. He moved through the square with the unhurried confidence of a man who has run this particular calculation many times and knows how it resolves. The villagers stood in their rows and he walked between them, checking faces. And he had the quality of attention of a man who is not looking for suffering and is not avoiding it either. Shh. He was looking for information, and the suffering of the people in his path was simply a byproduct of his methodology, which he had not been asked to care about. His armor was articulated gray, well-maintained, with the insignia of his rank. Chinku Shugan, General of the Pacified River, worked into the shoulder plate. The title was a kind of dark humor that the Empire did not seem to understand was dark humor. The river was not pacified. The river had sold targets and given them back on the far bank. And here they were, standing at the square's entrance. He saw them and he smiled, not a warm expression. An expression of a man who has been proven correct about something he was confident about. Sworn brothers, he said. Still standing. Still, Ryuubi said. You lost something in the river. Ryuubi did not answer that. He stood with his empty hands open at his sides, and the silence he kept was not embarrassed. It was the silence of a man who has already resolved his relationship with the uncomfortable fact, and has nothing defensive to add to it. Koshin had expected something different from this. See it. Just a flicker, just the briefest recalculation moving behind his precise eyes. He had studied Ryuubi. He had identified the sword as the structural element. He had engineered its removal, and he had expected to find a diminished target. The target was not diminished. The target was standing in the square with empty hands, and the expression of a man who has decided what he's going to do and is waiting for the right moment to do it. Koshin adjusted. He adjusted fast, which was the other thing about him. He never needed long to find the next variation of his plan. He nodded to the flanking troops, and they moved into the rows of villagers in a way that was clearly a demonstration, rather than an action. He was communicating. This is what happens if you do not cooperate. He was not threatening. He was informing. The Empire was very good at informing. Chuhi stepped forward, and Kanyu caught his arm without looking, which told me this was a familiar choreography. The sword is in the river, Ryuubi said. Cannot give you what the river holds. Then we take the next best thing, Koshin said. Your surrender. Acknowledged, witnessed, and recorded by the time we reach Rakuyu. We do not surrender, Ryuubi said. Still, no heat in it. Not defiance as performance, not bravado, more like a man correcting a factual error with patience. We do not surrender is simply true, the same way north is simply north. Koshin considered this for 2 seconds. Then he moved, and the geometry of the square rearranged itself, and the fight started. All 3 of them were very good. I have watched fights in enough frontier towns and canyon camps to distinguish between men who have trained and men who have been continuously tested, and these 3 lived in the second category. They had been tested until the test had become the permanent condition of their existence, and they had developed the specific adaptation of people who cannot afford to be wrong, because being wrong is final. Kanyu fought as though he and the ground were in an arrangement. He did not move unless the move was necessary, and when it was necessary, it was efficient in a way that made it look slow when it was not slow at all. He absorbed the first wave of infantry, turned their force sideways, found the structural weak point in every formation they ran at him, and pressed that point until the formation came apart. He had been hit twice by the time I was paying close enough attention to count. And he showed this by being slightly more careful in his movement, and nothing else. Chuhi was the opposite. Forward motion, constant, loud. The kind of fighter who wins by making the opposing force believe that the cost of stopping him exceeds the available budget. He had a reach advantage on most of what Koshin had in that square, and he used it without restraint. The children watching from the doorways, and there were several, flinched away from the loudest impacts, and then leaned back around the doorframe to watch, which told me something about how the display read to an outside observer. Ryuubi fought without the sword, and it mattered. Not because he was weak. He was not weak, but because something in the way he moved had been built around a specific weight and balance. And without it, he was a man reaching for a tool that was not where his hand expected it to be. He adjusted. He kept adjusting. Each adjustment took a fraction of a second, and in a fight at this level, a fraction of a second is a real quantity that accumulates toward a real outcome. Koshin had planned for this. He had let the sword go into the river specifically because he had studied Ryubi and understood this. He was watching his plan work, and it was working, and he was not hurrying because he did not need to hurry. He moved around the edge of the combat with the measured attention of a man watching an equation balance itself. He was not unengaged. He struck when the angles were right, tested the perimeters, maintained pressure in ways that were not flashy and were very effective. He understood that in a prolonged engagement, efficiency compounds. Every strike that costs the opponent more than it costs you is not a single transaction, but an investment. He was managing his investment portfolio with the cool attention of a man who has done this many times. Bridge had been phase 1. This was phase 2. Phase 2 was working. What I want to tell you, because it deserves to be said plainly, Koshin was not a villain in the way of stories. He was a competent man, doing a job he had been assigned, doing it well, doing it with the professionalism of someone who had earned his rank through demonstrated effectiveness rather than connections or cruelty. Cruelty in what he did was not personal. It was structural. The Empire had decided that Marisha needed pacifying, and it had built men like Koshin to do the pacifying. And Koshin did it the way a good craftsman does his trade, without pleasure, without regret, with the steady application of appropriate technique. He would have been a different man in a different empire. He was the man the Empire had made, doing the work the Empire had given him. Understanding this not make what was happening in the square any more acceptable. It just made it more real. It made the weight of the afternoon more specific. Not evil versus good, which is a story you can distance yourself from, but systems and the men who serve them, and the people who get flattened by both, which is the actual texture of occupation. I stood at the edge of the square with my horse, and the salvager's instinct talking very loudly in both ears. And I watched Ryuubi take a hit to his left shoulder that folded him to one knee, and I watched Kanyu driven back against a wall with 3 men holding positions on him, and I watched Chuhi, still loud, still moving forward, begin. Barely, but begin, to slow. And then Ryuubi got up, not dramatically, not with announcement, just put his feet under him, and stood. The way you stand when falling is not one of the options you have decided are available. His shoulder was wrong. He was bleeding above his left eye. He squared to Koshin and found something. Not fresh energy, nothing so simple, some other resource that is not stamina, and is harder to deplete. Koshin looked at him across the square, with the closest thing to respect I had seen from that man's face. Going to lose, he said, clinical. A weather report. Yes, Ryuubi said. Probably then. Keep going, Bashu. I had not told him I was still at the square's edge. He had known. I went to the river. The waterfall was 20 minutes upstream at a hard run. I had passed it many times in 2 years and always gone wide around it, because something about the air near its pool was wrong in a way that my horse detected before I did, and communicated through the specific set and direction of her ears. The locals said a dragon spirit lived in the pool at the waterfall's base. I had not disbelieved this. I had also not found it professionally relevant. The frontier accumulates a lot of things that are true and not useful at the same time, and a man with my priorities learns to sort his inventory accordingly. I left the horse at the path's edge and ran the last 500 meters on foot, because the trail was too narrow and too wet for her to navigate quickly, and I was already pulling off the salvager's pack that would pull me down when I reached the pool's edge. I stood there for a moment and looked at the water. The pool was larger than it looked from distance. The waterfall fed it from a height of perhaps 30 meters, a full unbroken column of white water, hitting the pool's surface and generating a permanent mist that hung in the air and turned the light above it into something diffuse and directionless. The sound was total. Not loud in the way of explosions or combat, but complete in the way of things that have been making the same sound without interruption since before anyone was alive to hear them. And that have no awareness of having been heard. It filled the space inside my head and pushed out everything else. The patrol schedules, the count of infantry in the square, the specific angle of Ryubi's shoulder when it took the hit that folded him to one knee. Gone. The sound of the water was the only thing. In the absence of all my practical considerations, what remained was simpler than I expected. I stood at the edge of a cold pool in a canyon with the sound of a waterfall replacing my thoughts. And what was left was not a calculation. It was a direction I went in. The cold was absolute. Not the cold of mountain rivers on hot days, which carries a kind of vigor in it. This was the cold of water that has never been warm, that maintains its temperature the way old stone maintains its shape, without effort and without adjustment, simply because this is what it is. My muscles went functional but reduced within 10 seconds. I kicked downward along the rock wall where the current ran at the pool's base, following the gradient the way I follow canyon roads, reading the terrain, moving along what offers least resistance toward what I am looking for. I could see nothing below me, no sword, no glow, no mythological marker, just the increasing darkness of water over deep rock, and the sound of the waterfall distorted by depth into something low and constant, and the cold pressing inward against my chest. And then I felt it. There is no useful vocabulary for this in the language of practical men, so I will describe it in the terms available to me, which are imprecise but the best I have. It was like being in a space you had assessed as empty, and discovering that the assessment was wrong, and had always been wrong, and that whatever occupied the space had been present since long before you arrived and had been making no particular effort to be known, simply existing with the confidence of something that does not require acknowledgement to continue being what it is. Old, not hostile, not warm, old, in the specific way that makes warmth and hostility equally irrelevant categories. It asked me what I wanted, not in words, not in sound. Question arrived in my mind already formed, the way certain understandings arrive in dreams, complete, requiring no assembly, bypassing the scaffolding of language entirely. I told it the truth, not the sword, not the tactical situation in the square above me. I told it what I actually wanted, which had built itself in the back of my mind over the last 2 hours without my permission, and was now fully assembled and too honest to dress up. I wanted the 3 men in that square to still be standing when I got back. I wanted the boy with the cut above his ear to reach adulthood in a Mauritia, where standing between a village and a tyrant was not a death sentence, not an example, not a lesson delivered to the next village, over at no additional cost to the empire. I wanted listen Toutaku's occupation had been teaching for years, that the practical man always makes the practical choice, that the cost of resistance exceeds any available budget, that the men on the edge of the square with their horses will always ride east. I wanted that lesson to be wrong, demonstrably, specifically, on the record, in a way that the next practical man at the edge of the next square could see and factor into his own calculation. I do not know what the river makes of human honesty. I do not know what standard an ancient thing uses to evaluate the requests of temporary creatures who enter its territory without preparation and without proper respect for what they are entering. The cold around me shifted. Something moved in the dark below, enormous, unhurried, not directed at me but moving in a direction that passed very close to where I was. And then there was a weight in my hands that had not been there before. The weight of it was specific, heavy in the way of iron, but dense in the way that certain things are dense when they carry more than their physical mass, when they have accumulated meaning and purpose and the particular gravity of belonging to the right person in the right moment. And I understood, without being told, that I had not been given this. I had been handed back something that had already found where it was going. I was the route, not the destination. I went up fast, hit the surface with my teeth already set, and my legs already moving toward the path. The cold followed me up and began to release as I ran, degrees at a time, and I covered the distance back to the square in less time than it had taken me to reach the waterfall, because I was not thinking about the distance. Shh. I was thinking about the sound I was listening for from ahead. Heard it. Still chewy, still loud, still therefore standing. I covered the last 300 meters at a pace I will not be able to reproduce until I am a different and probably younger person. I heard the square before I reached it. Specifically, I heard Shuhei still producing sound, which meant he was still standing, which meant the arithmetic had not yet finished. I covered the last 300 meters at a pace that I will not be able to sustain again until I am younger. What I found: Ryuubi on one knee, his head down, breathing the specific way of a man who is working hard to remain conscious while his body sends him detailed reports about the damage it has sustained. Pressed against the wall with two of Koshin's infantry holding positions that told me he had spent everything he had to get to that wall, and had not much left beyond the momentum of his own reputation for not going down. Shuhei 3 meters from where I had last seen him. Still upright, still generating noise, though the noise had a lower ceiling than before, and his movements had the quality of a man drawing on reserves he had not planned to need. Koshin stood in the center with the look of a man finishing routine paperwork. He had stopped pressing the pace. The pace no longer required his active input. He was waiting for the equation to complete itself, which it was doing, just slowly. I came into the square at a run and called Ryuubi's name. He looked up from the knee. Something moved across his face at what I was holding. Not relief, not joy, something quieter and more serious than either. The look of a man who has been handed back a responsibility he was not certain he was going to receive, and who is aware of the full weight of it. He stood. The shoulder was still wrong. The damage from the last hour was real and accumulated and visible. He stood anyway, with the same quality of motion as before. Not dramatic, not announced. Just the simple act of putting his feet under him, because the alternative was not an option he recognized. He looked at me. "But you, what did you say to it?" "I thought about this. I didn't make a bargain," I said. "I told it what I wanted. Truth of it." He held my gaze for a moment, then he nodded, slow once, and he turned to face Koshin. Koshin was recalculating. I could see it happening. That fast and precise mind working through the new variable, adjusting the plan's parameters, identifying the next viable pathway. The sword was back. The primary target was upright. The accumulated damage remained and could be factored. He had infantry in position. He called them forward and prepared to run the next variation of the plan, which was concentrated force at a target who has been severely reduced. He had studied Ryubi. He had studied Kanyu and Shuhei. He had run hundreds of fights against dozens of configurations of opposition, and he knew precisely how much a fighter could give before the giving stopped. He had not run this particular configuration before. There is a thing that happens in the middle of some fights. Rare, not guaranteed. Not something you can manufacture or force, where a group of people who have been through enough together stop being individuals, coordinating, and become something else. Not a tactical unit, not a formation. Something less like a constructed thing, and more like a current, or a wave, that knows its direction without needing to consult itself about it. I have seen it 4 times. Each time has had the quality of something private. Something that was not supposed to be visible. It happened in the square. Ryubi moved forward, and Kanyu came off the wall at the same moment, not in response to a signal, but in response to something the 3 of them shared that did not require a signal. Shuhei, who had been retreating, stopped retreating and started moving forward, and the 3 of them converged on Koshin's position with the coherence of water that has found the lowest point and is filling toward it together. The sound of it was different from the sound of individual combat. It was a chord rather than a sequence. It hit the ear all at once, before the mind could break it into component parts, and by the time you were processing the first impact, the second and third had already landed. Shin fought. He was very good. See, he had the advantage of relatively fresh energy against 3 men who had been fighting for an hour with significant injuries. He used this correctly. He found angles and pressed them, retreated when the press was not working, drew energy from the exchange and redirected it. He was doing everything right. He had done everything right all day. The thing about a wave is that doing everything right does not stop it. You can make the wave more expensive. You cannot make the wave stop being a wave. He drove Ryubi back with a combination that would have finished any of 100 other fighters. And Ryubi went back and came forward again. And the second time he did not go back. Kanyu closed the cleft side, and Chui closed the right, and the three of them did what they did. I still do not have the language for it, even now, even having seen it. That thing they do together when the moment calls for it. The simultaneous and coordinated action from three angles timed so precisely it arrived as a single event, and Koshin went down. Still, he was not dead. I could see him breathing from where I stood. Beaten, which for a man like Koshin was perhaps a different kind of outcome than death, and I was not equipped to assess which he would ultimately prefer. The infantry stood in the square for 4 seconds. Then they ran. Chuhi made a noise that startled the birds from the surrounding rock faces. Kanyu straightened with the measured care of a man taking an inventory of his own structural integrity before committing to any ambitious movement. Ryuubi looked at Koshin for a moment, not with satisfaction, not with anything that looked like triumph, with the gravity of a man who understands that today's defeated opponent is tomorrow's unresolved consequence. Then he looked up at the square, at the villagers coming out of their positions against the walls, careful at first, then faster, as it became clear that the men with weapons were the men leaving, at the children in the doorways, at the boy with the cut above his ear who was standing at the square's edge, barefoot, watching with large eyes. Ubi sheathed the sword. "Is anyone hurt?" he said. "Not is the fight over. Not we won. Is anyone hurt?" The village elder came forward first. She was a woman of 60, or thereabouts, who had been assessing difficult situations for long enough that she had developed the particular economy of movement that comes from not spending energy on anything decorative. She told Ryuubi the situation in the square, who had been struck, who needed attention, what Toutaku's men had taken on their way in, and what they had left behind when they fled. She delivered this information in the flat tone of someone who has decided that being precise is more useful than being upset. And Ryuubi listened with the same quality of attention he had given me by the river. Then the boy with the cut above his ear came forward, and Ryuubi crouched down to his level and said something I could not hear from where I stood. The boy nodded. Something in his face changed. Not relief, not safety, but the specific ease of a child who has found an adult who is telling him the truth, rather than a comfortable approximation of it. There is a difference between being told everything will be fine and being told exactly what the situation is by someone who respects you enough not to lie about it. Children notice the difference. Adults forget that they do. We stayed through the afternoon because it was safe. Koshin's patrol would be missed before dark, and the response when it was missed would be significant, and we had perhaps 4 hours. But there were people who needed 4 hours of help. And there were 3 men I was traveling with who were constitutionally incapable of leaving a place where people needed something they could provide. I did what I was actually good at, which was logistics. I knew the canyon roads from 2 years of working them. I knew which tracks Toutaku's patrols used and which ones they didn't bother with, and I knew the timing, the rhythms of the resupply convoys, the rotation schedules, the 3 gaps in the canyon's patrol grid where a group of people moving carefully could pass without being seen. I told the village elder what I knew. She asked 2 questions. Then she started organizing with the efficiency of a woman who has been organizing things her whole life and has no patience for being impressed by the challenge. Kanyu helped with the injured. He was better at this than his appearance suggested. He had a steadiness about him that was different from his steadiness in combat. The same quality, applied to a different problem, generating a different result. He was methodical. Not soft, not performing care. Just careful, the way a man is careful when the thing he is handling matters. Chuhi began repairing what he could of the structural damage Toutaku's men had caused on their way in. He was loud while doing it. The children who were recovering. Children do this faster than adults. They have not yet fully learned that they are supposed to carry it longer. Began following him in 1s and 2s, then in a small group. He did not perform indifference. He talked to them. I could not hear what he said, but I could hear when they laughed, and they laughed several times. Ryubi moved through the square without agenda, not with a purpose, not toward a specific task, just present, available, sitting with people who were not injured, but had been frightened the deep specific way that takes longer to heal than a wound. He did not tell them things were going to be fine. He did not make promises he could not verify. He just stayed near people who had been through something hard, and the quality of his presence, its steadiness, its lack of demand, seemed to function as a kind of ballast. I watched all of this, and I was aware of something I did not have precise language for. I had a working vocabulary built around loss and aftermath. Salvage, wreckage, remnant, what you could get for the iron at the next town. I did not have words for what these three were doing in the square. They were conducting the peace, which was apparently as demanding as the fight, and required a different kind of attention, and could not be done with weapons. Near the end of the 4th hour, I walked to where Ryubi was sitting and told him we needed to move. "Yes," he said, "you are right. The eastern road through the canyon has a blind spot in the patrol grid. It lasts about 40 minutes in the early night hours. We can move 20 people through it at a time, if they know how to walk quietly. We will need someone who knows that road," he said. "I know that road," I said. "I know all of them. I've been working them for 2 years. He looked at me without saying anything, not pressing, not asking, making room for whatever came next. "I have been using what I know to stay alive," I said, "to stay mobile, to stay out of the work gangs and the patrols and the consequences." "And now?" he said. I looked at the boy with the cut above his ear, who was helping an elderly man move a piece of furniture that was too heavy for either of them, and was managing it anyway through the application of determination and a complete ignorance of how physics worked. "And now I would like to use it for something else," I said. Ryubi stood. He did not make this significant, did not celebrate, did not mark it as a turning point, did not add weight to it that would have made it harder to carry. He simply stood and offered me his hand. "Then let us go," he said. "We have roads to learn and people to move." We moved the village in the dark. 31 people through the blind spot in the canyon's patrol pattern, 2 at a time with distance between pairs, using the route I had memorized across 2 years of practical necessity. Now run in the opposite direction, not hiding from the Empire's eye, but threading through the gaps in it. I went first with the elder, who turned out to be better at moving in the dark than most soldiers I had seen, and we marked the path with the small signals I had developed for my own use. And then I went back for the next pair. 3 hours. Nobody was caught. Nobody was left behind. When the last 2 people cleared the ridge and the canyon was behind us, I stood for a moment and looked back at the village below. Dark now, fires out. Toutaku's patrol line visible in the distance. A line of lights moving on a schedule, going nowhere that mattered tonight. 31 people on the far side of that line. A boy with a cut above his ear who was going to reach adulthood. I thought about the maps in my head. 2 years of them. Every road and patrol rotation and supply line and gap in the grid. I had built these maps to serve one person, who was me, and I had used them accordingly. The Empire's occupation works on a specific calculation, that the practical man will always make the practical choice, that the cost of resistance will always be made visible and immediate enough to outweigh the cost of compliance. The Empire is very good at this. It has refined the visibility of consequence into a form of governance. Every village that gets put down is a lesson delivered to the surrounding villages at no additional expense. Every man like me, who rides east instead of engaging with the trouble, is a demonstration of the lesson's effectiveness. The lesson was not wrong exactly. The cost I had seen was real. The men and women I had watched do something brave and die, for it were real, and their deaths were real, and the grief of the people left behind them was real. What the lesson missed was the calculation on the other side. The calculation Ryubi was making every time he stood up, because the lesson could be delivered endlessly, and the Empire could be very efficient about it. But it was still making the lesson about the wrong thing. The lesson was about cost. Ryubi was not calculating cost. He was calculating what he was willing to be. What shape he was going to have when this was over. What he would be able to say he had done with the time he had. And against that calculation, the cost was a real input, but not the decisive one. I had watched that and called it impractical. And then I had gone into a cold pool in the dark and told the truth about what I wanted to something ancient and indifferent, and it had handed me the weight of a thing that deserved to be carried by the right person. The maps in my head were going to cause a great deal of trouble for the Empire. I had decided this while standing at the pool's edge before I went in. I had decided it fully, not as an impulse but as a position, and the water had recognized it in me before I had said a word. We camped in the canyon's eastern reaches, in a hollow I knew about that the patrols had never found because getting to it required 30 meters of waist-deep water, which is an effective deterrent for men who have other options. Fire, cold food. Kanyu cleaned his weapons with the methodical care of a man who respects his tools. Chuhi cataloged the day at diminishing volume until Kanyu said one word, and the volume diminished further. Ryuubi sat with his damaged shoulder bound and his sword across his knees and was very still. After a while he said, "Bashu, still here," I said. "You went into that pool without knowing what was down there." I had a reasonable guess. "You went anyway." "I did." "Why?" he said. And it was not a rhetorical question, and it was not leading anywhere. He wanted to know. I looked at the rock overhead. Old rock. The kind of old that makes you understand your situation in geological terms rather than personal ones, which can be either comforting or depressing depending on the day. "Because you stood up without the sword," I said. "You had every reasonable argument to let the math work out the way Koshin designed it. You were injured. Your weapon was gone. You were looking at a man who had specifically removed the structural element he identified as load-bearing, and you stood up, and the only reason you gave was that you had said you were going to help, and you hadn't helped yet." I paused. "I have been practical for 2 years," I said. "Very good at it. And I watched you be impractical. And it looked like—" I stopped again, trying to find the word. It looked like something I had decided wasn't real. Like an argument I had already dismissed and stored somewhere where it couldn't cost me anything. And then you made it again, in the middle of a square with your empty hands, and I couldn't dismiss it from that distance. Nobody said anything for a while. "Ryufu is still out there," Chui said eventually, quieter than before. He watched the whole thing. "Yes," Ryubi said. "He's going to be interested." "Yes." "And Toutaku's going to know what happened to Koshin before tomorrow." "Yes." Chuhi was quiet for a beat. "Today more or less guarantees that tomorrow is worse." "Generally," Ryubi said. Another pause. Then Chuhi, "Good. I didn't come out here to be comfortable." Late in the night, when the others were asleep, I sat awake with the familiar argument running in my head. The argument my habits of survival had been making to me for 2 years, which had kept me alive and which I was now apparently in the process of retiring. The argument was still coherent. The argument was still making good points. The argument pointed out that Toutaku's response to Koshin's defeat would be significant, that it would be directed at the people it had seen in that square, and that riding with those people was choosing to receive that response personally. It pointed out that a man with my maps and my knowledge of the canyon roads had options that most people did not, and that exercising those options in the direction of safety was not cowardice but pragmatism, and that pragmatism was the reason I was still breathing when so many others were not. All of this was true. I was not arguing with it. I was simply noticing that it was no longer the most important argument in the room. The most important argument in the room was one I had been dismissing for 2 years by filing it under the category of things that were true but not actionable. The argument that the Empire's occupation was a machine that ran on the calculations of practical men, and that every practical choice made by every practical man was a contribution to the machine's fuel supply, that the machine needed me, specifically, in a way it did not need the warriors it was fighting against. It needed the men on the edges of the squares. It needed the salvagers who understood the patrol schedules and rode east. It needed the clerks who kept the records, and the farmers who paid the levy, and the scouts who stayed scouts, because they had looked at the cost of being anything else and found it too high. The machine's fuel was the cumulative decision of 1,000 practical men to remain practical. I had 31 people sleeping on the far side of a ridge who were on the far side of it because I had stopped being practical for 3 hours. I had maps that could put the next group of people through the next gap in the grid, and the group after that, and the 30 groups after that. Toutaku's patrol pattern had weaknesses that his generals did not know. I had cataloged because a scavenger working the canyon rivers for 2 years is effectively invisible to an empire that has categorized him as beneath strategic concern. I had been invisible, and I had been practical, and I had been alive. And all three of those things were true, and the version of me that had maintained them for 2 years was sitting in this hollow, having his last conversation before he became a different problem for a different set of people. I did not leave. I lay down and slept, and woke before the others, and I watched the sky go from black to gray to the particular cold, clear blue of high canyon mornings. And I thought about what I had told the river, and about what the river had heard in it, and about the fact that the river had simply listened and given back something that was already waiting to be given back. I was not a warrior. I was not a sworn brother. I was a man with maps and a horse, and a 2-year education in the specific geography of an empire's weaknesses. And that was apparently sufficient for the next part of this. I sat up, and Ryuubi was already awake, watching the same sky, and we looked at it together for a moment without speaking, and then he said, "Tell me about the eastern roads." And I did. In the morning, Ryuubi asked me about the eastern roads. I told him everything, every road, every rotation, every gap and blind spot, and supply line and patrol habit I had cataloged over 2 years of necessary survival, which was a substantial amount of information delivered over perhaps 2 hours of conversation that he conducted with the particular quality of attention he brought to all things, complete, without distraction, genuinely interested in the specifics and not just the summaries. He asked good questions. The questions clarified where my knowledge had gaps and did not burden the places where it did not. He had a strategic mind, under all the quietness. He thought in terms of people as much as terrain, and he understood the empire's occupation as a web of individual calculations that could be individually addressed, which was a more sophisticated understanding than I had expected. And, also, I realized exactly the kind of understanding you would develop if your primary metric was how to help people rather than how to avoid consequences. We rode east as the sun came up. The canyon road opened into broader country. The gray plains where Toutaku's presence was thicker, older, more settled into the habits of the land and the habits of the people who lived on it. It was harder country than the canyon, with fewer gaps in the grid and more eyes on the roads and the accumulated weight of years of occupation sitting in the posture of every man and woman we passed. It was the country where the work ahead actually lived. The canyon had been the approach. This was the territory. Shuhei was already cataloging his plans for it, at moderate volume. Kanyu was already watching the horizon with the patient attention of a man who has learned that the first sign of what is coming tends to arrive at the edges before it arrives at the center. Ryuubi rode with the sword at his back and said nothing, which was how he often rode. Not distracted, not absent, present in the full and unhurried way of a man who is already somewhere while still on the road to it. Somewhere above us, on the high ridge that ran parallel to the road, I knew without looking that Ryofu Tallgeese was watching. He had been watching at the cliff when Koshin fell. He had been watching us move through the canyon in the dark. He was a man who was interested in the successor to the sword. He had said this casually, from his height on the cliff, as though commenting on the weather. And the quality of that interest told me it was not the sword he was ultimately tracking. He was watching the man who had stood up without it. He was watching whether it held. The thing that had made Ryuubi stand in the square without a weapon was a permanent condition, or a single extraordinary moment. Whether it would be present tomorrow and the next day, and the day after that, when the price climbed higher than today's price, which it would. I was watching the same thing. I wanted to see how far it went. I had a strong sense I was going to find out. The road opened ahead. The canyon dropped behind us. The Empire's gray plains stretched out under a sky that was beginning to lighten at its edges. The cold burning off as the sun found its position. And there was a great deal of Mauritia still to cross, and a great deal of work still to be done. And none of it was going to be practical, in the way I had been practical for 2 years. Ruby looked back at me once. From the front of our small column. He did not say anything. He did not need to. We rode on. The morning was cold and clear in the particular way of mornings, after something has been cleaned away. After a rain, or a fight, or a decision that has been sitting too long inside a man and has finally been made. The road ahead was long. I had maps enough to find our way through, most of what waited on it. It was enough to start with. It was enough. The canyon had no opinion on what came next, and neither, finally, did I. We rode and the road decided for itself.